Want to get good at Lorcana? Do you not know what to play? Neither did I. I haven't played nearly enough games, but I know someone who did. B squared 24 played literally hundreds of games more than me. So when we had a conversation, he answered all my questions on how to get better. Do you want to know about the mechanic most players don't even use that will help you win way more games? Do you know that there's an AI bot out there grinding games that found a way to win 4% more often? Do you want to hear about a card that's so overhyped that people think it's amazing, they put it in decks and it probably will never do anything? All of this and more in this video. What's up, B squared 24?
What's up, dude? How are you doing?
Doing good. I've played Pokemon, I've played Magic the Gathering. What other games have you played besides Lorcana?
Right before I got into Lorcana, I was playing Pokemon, and I was about to start playing competitively, going to regionals and things like that. And then I saw Lorcana, and I was like, I want to do content for this, so I'm gonna pause on that. Before that, I played a lot of Legends of Runeterra. I like to say that's the card game that really taught me like how to play card games. Basically, I've been playing card games my whole life. Recently, in the past year, so trying to be a little bit more competitive and dive really deep into it.
So you're more on the competitive side. I'm more on the collecting side. So I think this will be a good balance between us. One of the first things that I noticed when I started playing the game was I got my initial hand and I was like, well, what do I ink? I want to keep all these cards. I want to play all these cards, but something has to go and be inked. What's the best way to go about that?
Yeah, so that can vary based on what kind of deck you're playing. I think across the board, there's one thing you really have to keep in mind. Every deck should have a win condition, right? Like there should be a combo you're trying to play, or there should be a deck style you're trying to play. So you could be playing aggro, you could be playing control, you could be playing mid range. You want to try to make sure that you have a turn one, turn two, and turn three. What I like to do is I like to think a couple turns ahead and just look at my hand and say, okay, what am I expecting to play like in the next 3 turns? Whatever that is in my hand, probably not going to ink that. You can ink expensive cards too. Like if you draw a card and it costs 8 ink or costs 7 ink to play, you're not playing that for multiple turns. And so even if you don't ink it right now, in the next 2 or 3 turns, it's probably going to end up in the inkwell anyway because you're going to start running out of cards to ink. Another thing to think about though is once you get later into the game and you start building up ink in your inkwell, you kind of need to transition away from inking those expensive cards because those are generally going to be your better cards. It's one of the more complicated parts of Lorcana, if I'm honest, figuring out every turn what you're supposed to ink. There's a lot of micro decisions. And the best players are going to be the players who have that down, know exactly what they need to ink and when.
I was really surprised. I thought it was really easy when I read the rules, but then when I first sat down to play, I was like, I have to make a whole lot of decisions that I'm not used to making this quickly in a card game. I mean, with Pokemon or with Magic, turn one and turn two are usually pretty simple, but I felt like I was making a lot more decisions really early on with Lorcana.
Yeah, I love to tell people that like Lorcana, the floor is so low for the game, right? Like you can teach your 8-year-old kid to play, but the ceiling is so high for that reason. Because it's just like you said, in Magic, turn one, turn two, you play whatever land is in your hand, and then you play, whatever 1 drop, 2 drop that you have. In Pokemon, it's pretty easy. You have your game plan that you're playing out. It's usually not too difficult to figure out what you're doing, and you're not having to really manage resources. But the fact that your characters and your cards you're trying to play are your resources, there's so many micro decisions, especially between that and the deciding whether or not you quest and you challenge and all of that. There's so many micro decisions in Lorcana that it's actually a super super strategic game.
So going off that, what do you mulligan? Because I've heard from the game designers that your mulligan or putting cards back and redrawing is the most important decision of the game.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Like the mulligan is honestly, I think like an undervalued skill that we've seen so far, just because that's exactly right. Like games can be made or broke just on how you mulligan. If there's a certain combo that you're looking for, you want to mulligan for that combo. There are statistics that I can't remember right now in regards to like the odds of finding a card if you mulligan your whole hand. I want to say it's like 60% or something like that if you mulligan your entire hand looking for one card. If your goal is to make it to the late game as a control player, you're probably mulliganing for stuff that can slow down your opponent during the early game. So like a really popular deck right now is a Ruby Amethyst deck. Sometimes they run Befuddles, sometimes they run Gastons. You're probably going to be looking for things like that so that you can slow down your opponent and make it to the late game. You have to make the decision, do I mulligan this 2 drop that I can play on turn two and hope can have an even stronger play? or do I keep the 2-drop so that I guarantee that I have a 2-drop play? And usually I think it's better to keep the 2 drops just so that you can guarantee something on turn 2. Worst case scenario, you draw the Simba and you can ink that 2-drop.
How many inkables do you really need in your deck, or do you like it create problems for yourself?
I usually look at how many uninkables can I get away with. So I like to hover around like 12 uninkables. I don't like to put more than that if I don't have to, because then you start running into issues where you're trying to ink every turn for the first couple turns of the game. You just increase the chances of you having a handful of uninkable cards. In Lorcana, the tempo of playing an inkable card every turn is so important to keep up with your opponent that if you go a turn without it, sometimes that can like make or break a game. I try not to go above 12 uninkables, but I've definitely seen decks that perform well, with as many as like 20 uninkable cards. It kind of just depends on what the deck is. The control decks can get a little bit more leeway on that because they are playing a little bit slower. They have a bunch of answers usually for your opponent's board and what they're doing. So it's okay if they can go a turn or two without inking anything. There's definitely a fine balance to have just because inkable cards are good and you want to put them in your deck because they're going to make your deck better. But if you can't put enough ink in your inkwell consistently, then your deck's getting worse also.
Do you know if they have a game design decision about what becomes uninkable?
From what I understand is cards that are supposed to be pretty strong usually get an uninkable card, like the stronger cards in the set, or cards that have potential to break the game in a way. And like, there's a lot we don't know, right? This is just set one, but the designers are multiple sets into the game at this point. Typically, uninkable cards are either just really strong or are on the verge of being really strong, maybe paired with something else. And so, like, you don't
Okay.
want people to just be running a bunch of super broken cards together and getting away with it.
I always get confused by some of the mechanics like singing. I'm like, well, is singing really that great if I'm going to exhaust a card? What benefit really is singing in most games compared to just paying the cost outright if you've only got like one or two cards in your hand?
Yeah, so singing is actually super strong, mainly because it essentially lets you play a card for free. Sometimes it is better to go ahead and pay for the card if you don't have, like, if you have high value characters on board or you have characters that are trying to quest for a lot of lore. Instead of singing with them, maybe it's better, maybe it's more valuable for you to just go ahead and quest with them or challenge if you need to get something off your opponent's side of the board. But typically, if you can quest for the unit, it's extremely strong because you're essentially getting to play a card for free and you're not wasting any ink. A lot of the cards, like there's some draw cards, there's some damage cards, even Be Prepared. I think the board wipe is a singable song. Or yeah, is a song that you can sing. And so it essentially lets you play the card for free and then decide and then like continue playing stuff out of your hand. So you're gaining an advantage from your opponent usually and then still able to do stuff after that. Especially the more expensive that the song is, the better that usually is because it's less ink you've had to use, right? Like if you play a 5 cost song and instead of playing 5 ink you sing with a 5 cost character, maybe you lose that character next turn, but that character is giving you a lot of value being able to sing that song, and you're able to play a bunch of stuff out of your hand presumably, since you didn't have to use so much ink.
Gotcha. Going along with singing, shift's another mechanic where I'm like, well, is it really better to shift or is it better to play a second copy of the card? When you put the shift on, you only get one of the character rather than getting a whole nother one.
I would say the main value that comes with a shift character is that ability to play it early. So if you're looking to shift for a character, there's usually two things I'm thinking of. One, you're either trying to play the character earlier than you normally would. Shift, I think across the board is 2 costs cheaper than the normal cost of the card. And partially because when you shift a character on top of a unit, you don't have to wait for that shift character to dry. So as soon as you shift that character, you can challenge with the character, you can quest with the character, you can sing with the character. It immediately opens up a lot of options to you. There have been games that I've won because I drew into my shift character that had more lore than the character that was on the board, and it was just enough lore to win. So I shift on top of the character and immediately quest and win for the game. Or there's shift characters that benefit from challenging other things. So you can surprise your opponent by shifting onto that character and immediately being able to challenge rather than just playing the character and then your opponent being able to work out, on their next turn, okay, how do I avoid this or how do I not? There are definitely times where it is better for you to just play the character rather than shift them. One that I think of is the Aurora shift card that gives everything ward. It's a relatively cheap shift card. It's only shift 3, but if you draw it into the late game and you already have another Aurora on board, yeah, it's just better to play the Aurora with the ink because now you've got two characters on board. You're generating more lore. You have more options. But if it's turn 3, then I want to shift onto the new Aurora because I get a big unit out, right? For 3 costs. There's not anything else that has 3 strength and 5 willpower. So you're getting a more powerful unit out on board, and you're able to do stuff with that unit the turn that you play it.
That's most of the ability things. But then the other problem I have is, do I quest or do I challenge? And how do I control like how many things are on the board?
Yeah, so this is just like I said, the mulligan and like inking is one of the more difficult decisions you have to make playing Lorcana. This is right up there with it. Like do I quest or do I challenge are the micro decisions in every Lorcana game that really affects whether or not you win or lose that game. And it's pretty difficult because there's not always a straight up just correct answer. Generally, you want to look at how much lore you have on your side of the board. You could quest with all of your characters on your side of the board. How much lore would you generate? And then the same thing for your opponent. If they quest with every character on their side of the board, how much lore do they generate? And then you want to reference the game state. So how much lore do you have and how much lore has your opponent already gotten? Because that will give you a good idea of how far behind you are or how ahead you are. If you have more lore on your side of the board than your opponent does, and you're equal in lore, it's usually best for you to quest, especially if the trades that they're going to take are favorable for you. If I quest with a unit and then they challenge that unit and both units are banished, you're very happy with that outcome because they didn't quest, I did quest, and now both characters are off the board. So I've furthered my win condition and they haven't. They've had to slow me down. But even sometimes it's still good to quest knowing that you're not going to have a favorable trade because if you quest for a turn and then your opponent challenges you and your character gets banished but theirs doesn't, there's damage still on their character and that's an extra turn that they aren't questing. So you're still applying pressure to them by questing and forcing them to do something that isn't questing. But on the other hand, if your opponent has more lore on board than you do, then you have to really start considering, okay, am I going to be able to catch up with these guys? Am I going to be able to keep up? Because if you're not, then, well, you're going to have to start trading with some characters and try to take more control over their board before they run away with the game. All of Lorcana from start to finish is a race, right? You start at 0 and whoever's the first to get 20. And so whoever is doing that fastest at any given moment has the luxury of forcing the opponent to deal with you. That's where you want to be in every Lorcana game is just you want to be the one in the driver's seat. You want your opponent to be playing your game, not the other way around.
So I guess going off that, so when's the best time to banish? Isn't there a card like Smash that's like do 2 damage, cost 2?
Yeah, yeah. So there's other ways that you can banish a character, and that's through items like Dragonfire or Smash that just does direct damage or just says banish a character. That's usually you have to read the board and figure out when that nets you a decent amount of tempo. If my opponent has a character on their side of the board and it's only generating 1 lore per turn, assuming that they're not already at 17 lore or something, that's not a super threatening character. So if I can avoid it, I don't want to use a card like Smash or Dragonfire on that character unless they have a really strong like ability or something, right? Oftentimes I'll pay attention to characters that I know are really good targets for the opponent to use to sing something. So there's like the Ariel that's a really cheap unit, but she can sing 5 cost songs. There's a lot of really good 5 cost songs out there. That might be worth banishing with a card like Smash because it's preventing your opponent from doing something. You also have to consider what cards your opponent can shift onto. If they've given you an opportunity to banish a card that can be shifted on, that's usually really good for you because that delays them being able to play that character for 2 turns, might potentially stop them in their tracks. You want to look for high value characters and banish those when you can. You're not trying to use your banish cards on cards that aren't super threatening.
So don't banish Flounder or don't smash Flounder. Just leave him.
Yeah, yeah, like, I wouldn't use Smash on Flounder, and a good way to tell this too is, like, Smash cost 3 ink to play, right? Flounder's a 1 cost unit, so your
Right.
opponent used 1 ink to play Flounder, and you don't wanna spend 3 of your ink to get rid of Flounder unless you really have to. If it's another 3 cost character, that's a relatively even trade, that's fine. How much did it cost them to play this character? How much is it gonna cost me to get rid of this character?
Another thing we struggle with a lot of times is it better to have stuff in play just to play a character when you can play it as early as possible, or hold off until the ability is actually useful when you play it?
This is definitely depending on the game state. So if you are ahead and you're applying pressure to your opponent and they're being forced to respond to you and deal with you, you can play the character just to add even more pressure, even if their ability isn't helpful right now. That's another character on board. That's more lore that you're gaining.
Yeah.
Or if you're worried about something like a board wipe or something that they might be holding back that is going to do a lot of damage to your board and remove it, then you can decide to keep that character in your hands so that you have something to play in case that comes down. You usually don't have the luxury to wait to play characters. If you have the opportunity to gain some tempo and get ahead, you want to go ahead and take that versus just holding on to a character because that character is not doing anything in your hand.
I guess right now, if you're a newer player looking to get into one of these decks, which ones would you say are the easiest to pilot? I mean, obviously, control's probably not the one.
I don't want to discourage anyone from trying anything. If you see a control deck and it really interests you, go for it, man. Like, people can learn how to pilot a deck. That's the fun of playing TCG. Play whatever you want, it doesn't matter. But if you're a really new player, you don't know a whole lot of TCG fundamentals. Yeah, control is usually one of the more difficult deck styles to play just because there are a lot of decisions. There's a lot of strategizing what you think the opponent has and what they don't. So I would maybe step away from control. I really like people to gravitate towards an aggro or a mid-range deck because an aggro deck is usually just much easier to pilot. You're essentially just playing cards on the field and turning them sideways and seeing if you can get to 20 lore before your opponent does. And so there's not near as much thinking or as involved decisions as a control deck. And then a mid-range deck will help teach a player how to evaluate board state and how to learn how to value certain cards in their hand and like when it's smart to play certain cards. And it's just you're probably going to have a less stressful time and a more enjoyable time just being able to play your deck and not having to think so hard, make a lot of decisions. Some of the things like control players will shoot themselves in the foot sometimes because like in order for a control deck to be good, you have to know how to pilot it well. So, the best players in the world might be able to have a 60% win rate playing a control deck, but then you hand it to the general public and they can't get more than a 45% win rate because they just don't know how to play it. So, yeah,
Right.
I would definitely try just an aggro or mid-range deck if you're new.
There's only 34 cards per color. As I mean, there's 204 cards. There's 6 colors. Are you afraid right now that the meta is going to go stale before Chapter 2 comes out?
Absolutely not. That's more because I think Ryan and Steve, the two co-designers for the game, did a really good job at designing and balancing this game. It's obviously just come out, but usually in card games, the quote unquote meta gets solved really quickly. And a lot of times there's like 1 to 3 decks that kind of sit on top. And if you want to win in a competitive setting, you just play one of those 3 decks. And at least right now, we're not really seeing that. Like, there's some decks that are pretty strong. People are continually finding new decks that also perform really well and that are really unique and interesting. And because we know that we are getting a new set every 3 months, that's not a ton of time, right? Like, that's just enough time for in the first month, everybody gets the cards, we all play with them, we all figure out what decks we like to play. Month two, the meta gets a little bit more solved. Month three, maybe the meta is finally solved, but at that point, we're starting to see cards for the next set, and then we're starting the whole cycle all over again, where we're evaluating the new cards, trying to see how it might shake up the meta. So I think we'll be getting cards fast enough that there's not going to be a ton of time for the meta to be really stale unless The new sets that come along don't change a whole lot of like what's strong at the current time.
I guess the current supply issues would slow down people solving the meta too because they just can't get access to the cards they want to play.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the things that's going to be really interesting to watch is, there's a couple major tournaments that have been announced. Just like you said, product is kind of hard to get, especially if you aren't willing to spend a lot of money. So people are going to just kind of have to get creative. Like if they don't have the exact deck list that they would like to run, they're going to have to find cards that they can slot in that do similar roles, and we might see some really fun matches where somebody wins or loses a match, not so much because like they were favored, but because an unexpected card came down that they decided to put in their deck because they didn't have all the cards they wanted to use for the deck.
I'm assuming at the bigger tournaments they're going to have all the cards because they'll spend whatever they need to spend. But for
Yeah, yeah.
for most local play stores, people around here can only buy 6 packs, and then they have to wait till September till more cards come. So
Exactly. Like you'll have your Winnabox tournaments, locally, and you might have, a couple dozen people come out, or you might have, 50 people come out. And just like you said, all of those people are not going to have the exact deck list that they want, especially right now. So it's going to make for, I think, a kind of fun environment. People are bringing whatever they have and whatever they can build. I think that's way more fun than there being just a set couple of decks that are really strong, and you know that you're going to probably play against two or three of those decks 7 times in that day just because that's what everybody's playing.
right. Yeah, I just like to think of it like a new MMO. The best part of a new MMO is when everyone's level and racing to the max level at the same time.
Yeah.
But it's everything's new to everyone now, so this is the best time to go out to a store. Don't wait till you have your perfect deck. I would suggest people go
Yeah.
out and play now.
Yeah, like this is the best time to test stuff. If you have a deck idea that you really like, don't worry about if it's good or not. Like just build it, try and play it, see if it hits off. Like you never know. Like this is the perfect time to just have fun and play decks that are really fun, and that you enjoy, and not be too worried about playing decks that give you the best chances of winning, because nobody knows that right now, and nobody has, or very few people have a lot of access to a bunch of cards anyway. So it's not going to be your rogue deck that isn't optimized versus all of the optimized metasolve decks. It's going to be your jank deck versus your opponent's jank deck, and whatever you guys can put together.
I mean, this is getting really nerdy, and if someone's listened to it now, they're pretty far into Lorcana. But have you seen cards that people just overvalue? Like, I don't know how many other games you
uh,
watch besides the ones you play, but are there any cards that you just see people like holding on to or play, and it doesn't seem to do that much in the deck?
that's a really good question. I'm actually I'm gonna pull up all the cards real quick and see if I can't find something. So I found a card that might be a little bit of a hot take, because when we
That's perfect.
first
That's perfect. That's what we
yeah
want. We can end the video on a hot take right here.
when we saw this card, a lot of people thought this card was gonna be insane. And granted, it is great when it pops off, but I think it's not gonna be as good as everybody thought it was. And that is Bell, Strange but Special. It's the Sapphire Legendary card. It's a beautiful card, and I think its abilities are super cool. So, like when it's on board, you can put an additional card from your hand into your Inkwell. And if you have 10 or more cards in your Inkwell, Belle gets +4 lore. So that's a total of 5 lore on Belle. She's a 4 cost character with 2 strength, 4 willpower, and just 1 lore normally. The problem with Belle right now is that there is so much removal in the first set that rarely ever does she like come out and actually do the big bomb, like I have 5 lore and I'm going to quest and win the game in 2 turns. um there's Let It Go, there's Dragonfire, there's Be Prepared, there's all of the steel shenanigans. There's a lot of bounce cards and Emerald that can bounce cards back to your deck. And so, like, the fact that she can't come onto the board and quest immediately, that you kind of have to wait for her to do her thing, I think makes for a lot worse. And just the way that we see decks being played right now, there's a lot of removal. And so I think she maybe is a little bit overhyped, and maybe a little bit more expensive than she should be, because I don't think she's super great in most decks, and certainly not the main win condition.
So isn't 10 ink like way too much? Like if maybe if it was like 8 or something, should probably be more playable, but at 10, it's just most games are probably over by then anyway.
Maybe, it's most okay in a Sapphire deck than anything because there are multiple ramp cards in Sapphire that can get you to 10 ink really quickly. They don't really struggle with getting to 10 ink super quickly. I think the problem is just like by the time you get up to 10 ink, your opponent is at enough ink that like they probably have removal options in their hand or ways to slow you down and keep that bell from actually doing what she's supposed to do.
Well, it's good. It was good having you. It was fun. I learned a lot. I hope other people do too. Anything else you want to say before we go?
No, man, this is awesome. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate all the good questions. I'd love trying to help new players learn how to get better at the game. You know, you people have fun winning, and the more that you learn, the better player you become. And yeah, so thanks for having me on.
All right. Well, people go subscribe to B Square 24.